All right, we're on the last video for the book of Job. This is lecture 8. We'll be looking at a big block of material here in Job 28:1 through 42:17. Now, let's look at Job chapter 28, and this is Job's discourse on wisdom. And there's an outline of this chapter in verses 1 through 11. Job described mining because he's talking about searching for wisdom, but he says that there's difficulty in mining, but there are those who go down into the earth. He says there's a mine for silver and place for gold, which they refine, and goes down into the darkness and searches out and goes into a shaft and hanging down. And he says in verse 4 that forgotten by the foot. It's the miners, they're deep down in the shafts, and they're forgotten of the foot of those who are walking up ahead or overhead them. They don't, those who are walking on the ground above don't know that deep below in the earth are these miners. And he talks about there are no birds that are flying around. And he says that they're searching for precious jewels, searching for gold and for silver and all these jewels. Then in verses 12 through 19, he says, but wisdom, where shall it be found? Where's the place of understanding? Humans don't really know the way of it. They don't. It's not found in the land of the living. The deep says it's not here. The sea says it's not with me. It can't be bought in a marketplace like a merchandise. You can't buy it with anything, with silver or gold. It's not even as, you can't be bought with the gold of Ophir in verse 16. And so he talks about how precious wisdom is, but where can it be found? And then in verse 20, he says, ask the same question, where then is wisdom? It's repeated from verse 12. And expects a negative answer. Where is it? Nowhere is the answer. But 20 through 28, God knows where it is. God is the one who is able to give wisdom. He even rules the world with wisdom. And then verse 28 is a verse that's like in Proverbs 1:7 and other places, and we probably talked about this. He says to humans, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. That's a summary statement of biblical wisdom, that it comes from the fear of the Lord. All right, in Job 29, Job is remembering better days than what he's going through. And in this section, in verses 1 through 5, he talks about the sources of his former happiness. And one source is his fellowship with God. He said, oh, that it were like it were the days when God watched over me. His lamp was shining above my head. By his light, I walked through the darkness. We were in close communion. He was yet with me, the first part of verse 5. So that's one source of Job's former happiness, but he doesn't feel like he has that now. Then in verse 5, the latter part of the verse, and my children were about me. And another source of Job's former happiness was the companionship of his children. And they're not there. They're not gone. We saw them in the early chapters, how that they had died. And then verses 6 through 25 is the respect of his community. And he says in verse 6, it's just like, used to be my steps were washed with butter. That's a metaphorical statement about overflowing abundance, washed with butter, and the rocks poured out rivers of oil. It's he says things were going well, great blessing. And I would go to the gate in the city, and the young men saw me, And they respected me. The aged even rose up and stood. The princes refrained talking. They wanted to hear what I would say. The voice of the nobles was hushed. And when the ear heard me, then it blessed me. I delivered the poor that cried and the fatherless that had no one to help them. It was so that, he says in verse 14, I put on righteousness and it clothed itself with me. So immersed was Job in righteousness and justice, they're like a robe that was draped around him. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. And he searched out the cause of those who needed his help. So he says, in that section there, 6 through 25, that's the third source of his former happiness. So fellowship with God, companionship of his children, and the respect of his community. Job was a respected leader in the city gate. Now, in verse 23, he says, it used to be like they waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouth for the later rains. In Bible lands, in the times of the Bible, there were two seasons, dry season and rainy season. And in the rainy season, there were the early rains, and there then are the later rains. And Deuteronomy talks about the later rains. The early rains were in the fall, and they would soften the ground for the farmer to plant. And then in the spring, you had the spring rains or the later rains. And Job says here, they waited for me. They waited for my words just as for the rain. That's how blessed I was. Now in Job chapter 30, 1 through 31, so that was his previous happiness. Now he reflects on his current misery. And here's the outline of that. Verses 1 through 8, he's despised even by the outcast, he says. They see me and they hold me in derision. It's almost like they would rather eat wormwood or mallows. It's a plant that grows in the salt marshes that's bitter, sour tasting leaves. And he says that even the outcast from society despise me now. And in verses 9 through 15, he is a byword to the outcast. I become their song, like a byword. They abhor me. And in verse 11, for he has loosed my cord. And I guess the he there is God. And the cord may be referring to the idea of God's bow aiming at him, or Job may intend that God had loosened the cord of his bow. And there's no restraint. And he says, I used to be blessed, but now they entangle my feet. They're looking to destroy me. Terrors are upon me. They chase my honor away. He doesn't have that honor anymore. In verses 16 through 31, he's become like dust and ashes. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. My bones are pierced and fall from me. My sinews take no rest. And this may be sort of literal language, talking about the effect of his physical disease, or it could be, as it probably is, poetic language, and he's just been dried up by this whole suffering, and his friends and his family have turned away from him. And he says at the end of the chapter, verse 31, that this is very pathetic. Therefore, my harp has turned to mourning, my pipe into the voice of those that weep. So it's not a time of celebration, it's time for mourning. Now in chapter 31, verses 1 through 34, Job proclaims his innocence. The friends have attacked him. He said he is righteous. It doesn't mean that he's sinless. They've attacked him because he says he's righteous. Well, in their theology, he's suffering, so he cannot be righteous. He must be a great sinner. But Job has proclaimed his innocence. In chapter 31, he goes through, he solemnly goes through these categories in proclaiming his innocence. And here's an outline of this. In verses 1 through 4, he says he has not sinned with his eyes. It's a beautiful statement in verse 1. I made a covenant, I cut a covenant with my eyes that I would not look upon a maid, a woman. And what he's saying, he doesn't look with lust with his eyes. He hasn't, because he made a covenant with his eyes. And in the reason is because God sees my eyes. So I watch my eyes. And that's a very wonderful teaching there. 5 through 8, he says he's not been guilty of moral insincerity. If I walked with vanity, and my foot has hastened to deceit, what's morally empty and unreal and insincere. Job says, I haven't walked that way. I didn't run that way. Let me be weighed in a just balance, and God will know my integrity. If my step is turned out of the way, my heart walked after my eyes, then let me sow and another eat. Now, verses 9 through 12, he's not been guilty of adultery. In 13 through 15, he has been a good master. He's been a considerate master over his slaves. If I withheld, he says, then I should be punished for that, but I haven't. And the reason he gives there in verse 15, did not he that made me in the womb make him? That's his slave. And did not one fashion us in the womb? Now in verses 16 through 23, he's been benevolent or helpful to the poor. If I withheld from the poor, or if I've not taken care of the fatherless, or any wanderer, that's a perishing, needy person who needs some clothes. If I've withheld from them, if I lifted up my hand against the fatherless, then he says, even let my shoulder fall from my shoulder blade. The idea is playing on words. If I lift up my hand against fatherless, then let my shoulder fall from my shoulder blade. My hand's been guilty of oppression, then may I be deprived of my arm. In verses 24 and 25, he has not abused his wealth. Job was a wealthy man. He says, if I've made gold my hope, and have said to the fine gold, you're my confidence, if I rejoiced because my wealth was great, I haven't acted that way. Verses 26 through 28, he's not been faithless to God. If I saw the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness, and my hand has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, to say to the sun and moon, you're gods. That's the way the idolaters did. And my mouth has kissed my hand. It says my hand has kissed my mouth. Job denies that his hand ever touched his mouth in worship to the sun or the moon. That was widespread worship in the ancient Near East. The prophets over and over talk about that. Jeremiah and Ezekiel and others. And Job says, I haven't been faithless to God in doing that. I would have lied to God I would have denied God if I did that. Then verses 29 through 34, he's blameless in his conduct toward fellow humans. The stranger didn't lodge in the street. My doors I opened to the roadside in verse 32. To the traveler, it's to the way. The doors of Job's house were open wide to the crossroads to welcome anybody who came through who needed to stay there. His hospitality is so widespread and genuine, is what he's saying. And so he says, I haven't been blameless in my conduct toward fellow humans. Now, just to go back briefly to that, where Job is proclaiming his innocence. Well, usually when we hear somebody talking that way, we don't like it because it seems like they're boasting and they're filled with pride. But I think we have to keep in mind the context here that Job's friends have charged him with great sin. And Job says, I'm not saying I'm sinless, but I haven't sinned in the way that you say that. I haven't sinned to deserve this. I haven't acted in these ways. Look at my past life. And so he's justified, I think, in bringing these things up. Now in verses 35 through 37 of chapter 31, he desires an audience with God. Oh, that I had one to hear me. And it's almost like it's a legal, there are legal words here. He says, here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. He affirms his innocence. It's like he's writing it down, signing it. Here's my solemn signature that I'm innocent before God. Now, the Hebrew word for signature there is, in this legal language, is the Hebrew word tav, and that's the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it means to mark or to sign or sign something, or his signature. So there in verse 35, here's my signature, here's the tav. I make this tav, make this mark. And if you studied Hebrew, that's the way the tav looks. So it'd be sort of like that. Job wouldn't say it would be that artistic, but he says, here's my signature, my tav. Now, in verses 38 through 40, we have the conclusion of the words of Job. Now, he's going to speak again, but he's going to speak again in response to God. But this is in the cycle of the friends, and you remember how that cycle just kind of ran down, and Job now has been speaking for some time here. But his conclusion here of his words, if my land cries against me, if I've eaten the fruits without money, if I've done any of this, then in verse 40 we have finally the fulfillment of this. Let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. And then the last phrase there, the words of Job are ended in this dialogue. Chapters 32 through, and that should be 37 instead of 27, are the speeches of Elihu. And Elihu is this young man, and I guess he's been there the whole time since these speeches have been going on between Job and the three friends. But he hasn't spoken, and now he's going to speak. Here's an outline of this, and again, that should be 32 through 37. I guess I probably did it on each one of these. But notice in verses 1 through 5, his wrath is kindled. So it was the end of the words of Job. Then these men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. The friends we're just going to give up because you're righteous in your own eyes. God has afflicted you because of that. Then was kindled this wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram. And his wrath is kindled against Job. And notice in these verses 1 through 5, how many times it's stated that his wrath was kindled. It's in verse 2, his wrath was kindled against Job. It's in verse 3, also against Job's three friends was his wrath kindled, because it's against Job because he keeps saying he's righteous, against the three friends because they can't answer him. And in verse 5, when he saw that there was no answer, his wrath was kindled. So he's angry. He's an angry young man. And then in verses 6 through 10, he states that wisdom is not necessarily with the old. I'm young and you're old. Now I've held back, But wisdom is not necessarily with just the old. I have some things to say here. He's going to say to Job too, you need to listen to what I'm saying. So 6 through 10, he said in verse 10, listen to me. I'll give my opinion. I'll give my words. I waited for your words. I listened, but I waited for the friends to answer Job. Nobody was able to do anything. And so I'm going to give my words. And verse 15 through 22 is a soliloquy. And he, I think, is speaking to himself, and he's saying about the friends, oh, they're amazed. They don't answer anymore. Words have gone from them. It's departed from them. And should I wait because they can't speak? Well, I think probably I need to speak because I'm so full of words. It's like wine that has no vent, like new wineskins ready to burst. Well, let me speak. I don't respect a man's person. In verse 21, I'm not flattering anyone, and I don't know how to flatter. He says. In chapter 33, as Elihu keeps speaking, because he speaks from chapter 32 to chapter 37. In verses 1 through 7, he speaks to Job. I open my mouth and I will utter uprightness of heart. And he says, I am speaking the truth. I'm speaking for God. In verses 8 through 11, he's restating Job's claims of innocence, because that's what Job has been saying over and over. I'm clean without transgression. I'm innocent. Verses 12 through 27 of chapter 33, he says, God speaks to humans in different ways, in various ways. I'll answer you, and he's speaking through me. He speaks in one way, another way. Humans don't perceive it. Verse 15, maybe it's in a dream or a vision, and he opens the ears of humans. He's revealed this. In verses 29 and 30, he speaks of the divine purpose of discipline. That's what's happening, Job. You're being disciplined. God does this work to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened. So, if you'll just realize that you've sinned and confess your sin, God is disciplining you to bring you back from the pit. And 31 through 33, he urges Job to listen. Mark well my words. Listen to me. Hold your peace and I'll speak. And if you have anything to say, then you can answer me. But if you don't, just listen to me. Hold your peace, and I'll teach you wisdom. In chapter 34, he summarizes Job's plea in verses 1 through 9. He said, hear my words. As the ear tries food and the palate tastes, or the ear tries words and the palate tastes food, then listen to my words. For Job has said, verse 5, I am righteous. God has taken away my right. In verses 10 through 15 of chapter 34, Elihu says, God never acts unfairly. Listen to me. It's really human fault. It's not God's fault. And then in verses 16 through 20, it's just unthinkable, Elihu says, that the ruler of the world is unjust. If you have understanding, you'll hear this. You'll understand what I'm saying. I mean, is it fit to say to a king, an earthly king, you're wicked, you're not just? And then you're able to say this, and you want to say this to God? In verses 21 through 30, Elihu states that God knows all when he condemns. And he is condemning you, Job, because of your sin. God knows what he is doing. And you've criticized God, and you criticize God in ignorance, verses 31 through 37. To the end of that chapter. And you've added rebellion unto your sin in the way that you have talked. you multiplied your words against God. See, in verse 35, he says, Job speaks without knowledge. Were Job tried, he will realize God is going to condemn him. So that's chapter 34. He still continues his rant, his talk. In chapter 35, verses 1 through 8, Elihu answers Job's claim that he's righteous before God. You think that you're right, and you say, I'm righteous before God? In verses 1 through 8, I'll give you an answer. You're not righteous before God. Your wickedness is showing. That's what he's saying. In verses 9 through 16, he answers Job's claim that the cry of the innocent is not answered by God. See, Job is saying, God doesn't answer me. Where is he? And he says, the innocent cry for help. And he says they cry, no one gives the answer because of the pride of evil men. God won't hear emptiness. You're crying out to God. You think he's going to hear it. He won't hear emptiness. And Job opens his mouth in emptiness or vanity in verse 16. Then we come to chapter 36. In verses 1 through 21, Elihu gives his thoughts on God's design of the universe. An affliction. And in verse 2, suffer me a little, and I'll tell you. Wait, just wait. Show me a little honor here. And there are words for God on God's behalf. He says, I will tell you wisdom. I'll tell you knowledge from afar. And he says you need to listen to this wisdom that I have. In verse 22 through 33, he states that God is infinitely great and wise. God does loftily in his power. Who can teach to him? That's his way. And he says God is great, verse 26. Who can measure up to God? And then the last verse of the chapter 36, he's like a storm. It's the cattle. If a storm is coming, the cattle, usually livestock, know something is going. Even the animals in the field have an awareness of this approaching storm. And so he says God is infinitely great and wise and powerful. Now, chapter 37, and this is the last chapter of Elihu's speech here. He gives the effect of God's voice in nature. He says, at this my heart trembles, and it's moved out of place, verses 1 through 13. He sends this lightning. It's roaring. His voice roars. It thunders. He thunders greatly. And the beasts go into their caves, and they remain because they're frightened. Verse 9, he thought, or some thought, there was some chamber where the storms were stored, and he'd bring them out. And by his breath, God, ice is given. And he's talking about this tremendous power of God in a storm in verses 1 through 13. And verses 14 through 24, he appeals to Job. Hearken to this, Job. Listen, stand still, consider the wondrous work of God. In verse 14, to learn this lesson that nature teaches. And he asks some of the same type of questions like God is going to ask later. Can you spread out the sky? Verse 18. Can you? Do you have that power? But the Almighty is the one who has that power, is what he says through the end of the chapter. All right, in chapter 38, verse 1 through chapter 41, 26, God now answers. And this is the height of poetic splendor here. Job had cried out throughout the book that he wants to be answered by God, and now his wish is granted. This is God is going to answer. And in verse 1, in this outline, 1 through 7, God answers him, and he answers him out of the storm. Now notice there's been, 6 chapters of Elihu speaking, but that he's now completely ignored. God answers out of the whirlwind, out of the storm, this upheaval of nature. Who is this that darkens counsel with words without knowledge? He says, gird up your loins and speak to me like a man. Tie up your robe and stand before me. And 1 through 7, he asked him about creation. What do you know about creation when the foundations were laid and when the morning stars sang together? And that's probably the brightest stars, the most glorious. And they sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Sons of God, I guess, were angels at the remainder of creation. Then verses 8 through 11, he asked him, so he's going to ask him all these questions. And who shut up the sea with its doors? Who controlled these primeval waters? In verses 12 through 15, who commands the morning? Have you commanded the morning, Job? That you're able to be in control of each day? And then 16 through 18, he asked Job if he's entered into the depths of the springs of the sea, or in the recesses of the deep. This Tehom, the Hebrew, the foundations of the great deep, the deep passages in the sea. Have you been down to the depths of the earth? Have you surveyed the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know it, if you have. Verses 19 through 21, he asked Job if he knows the source of darkness, or of light and darkness. Where is the dwelling of light, and as of darkness, where is its place? Are you able to give that answer? Verses 22 and 23, have you entered into the treasuries of the snow and of the hail? He says that I reserve these for the time of trouble, against the day of battle and of war. In Joshua 10 verse 11, as the people conquer the land, God uses hail to fight against 5 kings in Gibeon. He uses hail in wars to even change the course of history, as he did there in Joshua 10 verse 11. Continuing this outline here in 38 verse 24 through 30, he asks if Job can explain light. How's the light parted? Can he explain the wind, the east wind? Can he explain lightning? Can he explain the rain and the dew and the frost? Verses 31 through 38, he asks if he can explain and control these heavenly constellations, Pleiades, Orion, Mazzaroth. Can you control these? Can you control clouds and lightning? And then he says in verses 39 through 41, will you hunt the prey for the lioness, and for the young lions satisfy their appetite? Can you take care of the raven? In verse 41. So even here are animals that may be in the remotest part of the whole world, and even animals that humans might not ever see. And then God asks Job, were you able to provide for them? God is providing for them, even daily. Now in 38, in this section, really beginning in chapter 39, 1, God is going to ask Job if he knows the habits of various animals. Let me get over here with another version. Yeah, do you know the habits of various animals? And I have some pictures here, and this might be a little interesting, or more interesting. So, Does Job know about the wild goats? Ibex in chapter 39. Are you able to take care of them? In 39:5 through 8, are you able to take care of the wild donkey? Do you know about the wild donkey? Again, who's living in this barren land? In chapter 39, 9 through 12, what about the wild ox? Are you able to take care of the wild ox? He says, will you bring the seed in the threshing floor? In chapter 39 and verses 5 through 8, again, I think that verse is... I've gone back in my slides. So there's the wild goats, the wild donkey, the wild ox. And then 39:13 through 18, he says, do you know about the ostrich? And he says the wings of ostrich beat, and she leaves her eggs on the ground and then forgets about them, and she's hardened against them. God hasn't given her wisdom in verse 17. So are you able to take care of the ostrich? And in verse 13 of 39, he mentions the stork in contrast to the ostrich. Let me see. See if that verse, this translation has verse 13, the ostrich's wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love. And some other translations in the Hebrew points out the idea that this is probably the ostrich is in contrast to the stork, or her wings and feathers like the stork. And the word there that's translated stork is kasidah, and it comes from the Hebrew word, the noun chesed, meaning loving kindness. So you have the stories that the stork wings the babies and things of that sort. Chapter 39, 19 through 25, are you able to take care of the war horse? In the Bible, the horse is always an animal employed in war or of kings. And this horse here is fierce, and even leaping like a locust in verse 20. And in Joel 2, verse 4, the locust is compared to the horse. Back in Job here, he says, the horse paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He mocks at fear. And the quiver rattles and the horse gets excited. He hears the voice of the horn, and he goes, aha, and he smells the battle far off. Then in verse 26, does the hawk soar by your wisdom and stretch her wings toward the south? Verse 27 through 30, does the vulture mount up at your command and make her nest on high? These vultures have their nest way up in these rocks. Job, do you understand all these animals? Can you take care of all these animals? God asked him. Now, in chapter 40, God says, are you going to continue to argue with me? And then we have Job answering again, and he answers in verses 4 and 5. And he says, in verse 3, then Job answered. In verse 4, behold, I'm insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I won't speak. I won't answer. He has no reply to God. And it seems like I left out verse 3 there in that outline. So God continues in verses 6 through 14. Can you rule the world? Are you able to take care of my world? that I created. By your own power can you do it. And then he talks about the proud, verse 12, look on everyone who's proud and humble them. Can you do that? Are you like me? Are you like God? And then he gives, it seems, two illustrations of the proud. In chapter 40, 15 through 24, he speaks of, in verse 15, Behemoth, and then in 41, in the English, 41, 1 through 34, let me get over there and see what that is. Yeah, he says Leviathan or Leviathan, and we're going to talk about those two now. Behemoth in chapter 40, 15 through 24. Some suggest that by its description that this is the hippopotamus, and the Greek word the Greek for hippopotamus is potamos is river, hippo is horse, so river horse. Others suggest that the designation here, behemoth, is the plural of behemah. Behemah is the common word for cattle or beast. And the fact that it's plural behemoth may denote large size. And some people even question whether these two creatures here that are mentioned, Leviathan and Behemoth, are literal creatures, or they're just fables, beast of fable. But in chapter 40 and verse 15, God says, Behemoth, which I made as well as you. So I made this creature just like I made you, Job. So, is Behemoth the hippopotamus? Leviathan in chapter 41. And now back in Job chapter 3, where Job curses the day that he was born, Leviathan seems to be mythological and metaphorical. And also Psalm 74:14 and Isaiah 27:1 seem to be mythological, like some sea creature. Yet the context here in chapter 40, I think, points to not a mythological creature, but a literal one. And Psalm 104 is talking about something, I think, that's not mythological, but literal. So some suggest that Leviathan is the crocodile. Leviathan is the crocodile. And there's a picture of a fierce crocodile. And the description that's given here, can you press down his tongue with a cord? Are you going to put a ring in it and lead it around like a pet? Or are you like a small bird or something? Are you able to make a covenant? Or will he make a covenant with you? Will you play with him like a bird? Can you control him with the great power that he has? I mean, nobody is so fierce to stir him up. And when he moves, he just stirs up all the ground, the sand. His scales are his pride. They're so close together. In chapter 41 and verse 18, his sneezes flash forth light. That is a word that means like it sounds. The word is atistan. And when he sneezes, the spray forces through his nostrils, and it's like flashing light in the bright sun. And out of his mouth goes these burning torches. And it's a very terrifying animal, if it is a crocodile. If it's not, it's still going to be terrifying. His breath kindles clothes or coals. His neck, there's great strength. And you go after him, and he's going to be difficult to take. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones are turned with him into stubble. Clubs as well. I mean, these when he moves in the mud, you can see where he has been, and it's like even there's a seething mixture when he moves. He stirs up this white frothy foam when he moves. There's no one that's like him, God says. So is it the crocodile? I don't know. Chapter 42 then is the last chapter in the book. And after this, after discussion of Behemoth and Leviathan, or Behemoth and Leviathan, Job answers the Lord and said, I know, I don't know how to answer. I'm humbled by all this. And he says that I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. His previous knowledge of God, of hearing of him, was through the traditional theology that the friends are still holding. And that theology had left no room for the suffering of the righteous. If someone is suffering, it's because they've sinned in some great way. Now Job's lived through that, and he can no longer hold to that. He has seen God, and all has changed. And in verse 5, I think the idea is, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, is that I have a bigger picture of God by this whole experience. And that's what the effect of this book is to have upon us. In verse 6, he says, and here are various translations, they're pretty much the same. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. Wherefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. Therefore I despise myself. In verse 6, it just has, I abhor. Myself is not there. I retract. Maybe he retracts his legal case against God. But then he says, and repent, Job, in dust and ashes. So did Job repent? Well, yeah, he did repent in the text, in the various translations there. But it's significant and interesting that the word translated repent here is not the ordinary word translated repent throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. This is not the word shuv. Shuv means to turn, and to turn away from sin. It means to morally turn. If a person is living in sin, the prophets say shuv, to turn. That's not the word that's here. The word here is nakam. And nakam can mean comfort. And in fact, the grammatical form of this, it could be comforted. I retract, and I am comforted. But it's used in verse 11 when his acquaintances come and they eat bread with him and they comforted him. That's the same word, nakam. And the word can also have the meaning of changing one's mind, and is used of God, as God is the subject of doing this in some passages. Let me just read these. Go over to Exodus 32 and verse 12, and it says, why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Moses is asking God to relent. That's the NIV there, I think. Let me go over to the New American Standard and see what it says in Exodus 32 and verse 12. Because that word nakam says, turn from your burning anger and change your mind. about doing harm to your people. That's the word nakam, change your mind. In Joel chapter 2, and that was New American Standard, Joel chapter 2 in verse 13, it says, rend your hearts and not your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and relenting of evil. That relenting is nakam. In Jonah chapter 4 and verse 2, God sends the prophet to go preach at Nineveh. And in verse 2, he prayed to the Lord and said, please, Lord, was not this what I said? See, when they repented, he preached and they repented. Was not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity, one who changes his mind concerning calamity. They repented, and so God changed his mind concerning calamity. That's the word that's used here in Job 42, verse 6. Job says that, therefore I retract and I nakam, in dust and ashes. Maybe I've changed my mind about some of this. I mean, at the end of the book, God says that Job has spoken correctly about him. He's spoken rightly about him. God didn't say to Job at the end of the book, you need to repent. He says to the friends that you need to go to Job. You haven't spoken correctly about me. And so he says, you take 7 bulls and 7 rams, verse 8, go to my servant Job and offer up burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you. You've not spoken to me the right thing as my servant Job has. And it's pretty interesting that you have my servant Job, my servant Job, my servant Job. And so God doesn't tell Job to repent at the end. He tells the friends, you haven't spoken rightly about me. And the text tells us that they did as God commanded them, and the Lord accepted Job. In verse 9, it means the Lord accepted Job's prayer on behalf of the friends, I think. And he changed the fortune. He turned the captivity. He restored to prosperity the fortune of Job when he prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. And all his friends came, as we said, and they comforted him. And the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. And now he has 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters. And then the names of the daughters are given. Remember the simple outline here. We have the prologue 1:1 through 2:13, the dialogue with the 3 cycles of speeches, and God's Elihu's speech and God's speech in Job 3:1 through 42:6, and then the epilogue. And God rebukes the friends, and God restores Job. And then, as what I was saying about his daughters, the names are given. We don't have the names given at the beginning of the book. Now the names are given. And the first one in verse 14, he called the name Yamimah. And that means little dove. And the name of the second is Ketsia, and that means like a sweet-smelling spice, Ketsia. And then the name of the third is Karen Hapuk. Karen Hapuk. And Karen means like the rays of the sun, or it can mean a horn, and the idea of radiating. And the second part of the name there probably means like eye paint or antimony. a chemical used in ancient times as cosmetics. So it may have something like the irradiating of the eyes, of the eye paint. But we're told here, in all the land there were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them inheritance among their brothers. And the last two verses of the book, after the suffering, after this whole episode, Job lived 140 years. And he saw his sons' sons into 4 generations, and he died being old and full of days. And that phrase, old and full of days, is similar to what's said of Abraham in Genesis 25:8, and also of Isaac in Genesis 35 and verse 29. And so we have come to the end of this wonderful book of Job. It's not an easy book. It's a difficult book. But I think that we can learn from this book. Throughout, Job maintains his innocence, and it teaches us that the righteous can suffer. And yet Job, I think, has learned something going through this that he did not know before he went through it. Okay, so we're going to stop. That's the end of Lecture 8.